The dust had not even settled from the wagon wheels when Garrick Voss spat at her feet. "They send us a broken thing," he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, loud enough that the merchants at their stalls stopped weighing grain and the children stopped chasing the dogs between the water troughs. "Look at that armor. That's not even hers. That's a dead woman's steel, hanging off her like a borrowed shroud." Dura Rageborn did not look at him. She looked instead at the crooked wooden sign that read STONEWELL Crossing, Trading Post and Wagon Rest, swinging on its chain above the well house, and she let the silence stretch until it ached. The armor Garrick mocked was fitted leather, hardened and lacquered dark as a raven's wing, molded close to her body in a way that spoke of a smith who had known the exact curve of the woman who wore it. A cuirass that hugged her ribs and the swell of her chest, tassets of overlapping leather plates that swayed against her thighs when she walked, vambraces etched with the twisting rune of the Rageborn clan. Beneath it, a underlayer of supple deer hide clung to her like a second skin, dark green against the deeper green-brown of her flesh. Two thick braids, black shot through with a single streak of ash gray, fell over her shoulders and framed a face that was fierce and beautiful in the way a mountain is beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, tusks that curved neat and short from her lower lip, and eyes the color of amber caught in firelight. She was tall enough to look most men in the eye without lifting her chin, and she carried herself like a woman who had never once needed to ask permission to exist. But her hand, resting on the pommel of the short sword at her hip, had gone white-knuckled. "That armor belonged to my sister," Dura said, and her voice was low and it carried across the square anyway, the way distant thunder carries across open plains. "She wore it the day she died defending the very treaty line your kind begged for. If you would like to say more about it, Garrick Voss, I will not stop you. I will only ask that you say it to my face and not to my boots." The crowd murmured. Someone near the grain stall laughed nervously and was hushed. A wagon driver reined in his mules to watch. This was Stonewell Crossing on a market day, and market days did not usually include the delivery of an orc bride in dead woman's war leather. But then, nothing about the treaty had gone the way anyone expected. Garrick Voss was a rancher, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of red, wind-burned face that came from 20 years of shouting at cattle, and more recently, from 20 years of resenting anyone who had lost family to orc raids the way he had lost his brother. He did not step back. He stepped closer, closer than any sane man would step to an armed orc woman a head taller than himself, and he reached out and hooked 2 fingers under the strap of her cuirass as if he meant to tear it from her shoulder and show the crowd how little was underneath. "I say we ought to see what we're actually getting," he sneered, "before some fool ties his life to it." He never finished the motion. Dura's hand closed over his wrist faster than the eye could follow, and she twisted, not hard enough to break bone, though everyone watching understood she could have, only hard enough to bring the big man down onto one knee in the dust with a strangled grunt of pain. His arm bent at an angle that made the muscles stand out along his forearm like rope pulled taut. "Touch my sister's steel again," Dura said, quiet now, quiet as a knife drawn from its sheath, "and I will show this whole crossing exactly what an orc bride is made of." That was when Noah Hale stepped out from beneath the shade of the wellhouse awning, wiping his hands on a rag that smelled of tallow and rope, and said, in a voice that was neither loud nor commanding but simply steady, "That's enough, Garrick." Every head turned. Noah Hale was not a large man, not next to Garrick Voss, and certainly not next to the orc woman holding him folded in the dirt. He was lean and sun-browned, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had not yet decided whether it belonged to a boy or a man, though he was near 30 and had the calloused hands of someone twice that. He wore a plain work shirt rolled to the elbow, leather trousers gone pale at the knee from kneeling at well mouths, and boots caked in the particular red clay that only came from the deep wells south of the crossing. He was, by every account in Stonewell Crossing, the best well-digger the valley had ever known, and by every account also the quietest, loneliest man to ever hold that honor. This isn't your fight, Hale, Garrick growled, still on one knee, still held. No, Noah agreed. But it's my wedding day, and I'd like it to start without anyone bleeding in the square. He looked past Garrick up at Dura, and something in his plain, tired face was not fear, though every instinct in the crowd seemed to expect it to be. You can let him go. I don't think he'll try that again. Dura studied him for a long moment, this small, unarmed human who had inserted himself between an orc warrior and the man she'd been about to break, and who had done it not with a blade drawn but with a rag still in his hand and tallow on his fingers. Then she released Garrick's wrist, and the rancher scrambled back, cradling his arm, cursing under his breath as he retreated into the crowd. Noah did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the sheriff's deputy who had finally roused himself to push through the onlookers, 3 breaths too late to matter. He looked only at her, and he asked the one thing that no one, not the town council, not the clan elders, not the priest who would bind them, not a single soul in the whole dust-choked square, had thought to ask since the wagon carrying her had crested the far ridge that morning. What's your name? The question landed on Dura Rageborn like a stone dropped into still water, and for a moment she simply stood there, sword hand slowly uncurling, amber eyes fixed on this small, unremarkable man who dug wells for a living and had just asked her, not the bride, not the orc, not the treaty price, not the broken thing Garrick Voss had called her, asked her name. Dura, she said, and her voice, for the first time since the wagon wheels had begun turning at dawn, did not sound like thunder at all. Dura Rageborn. Noah Hale, he said, and held out his hand, the rag still bunched in his other fist, tallow-stained and rope-scarred, as ordinary as any hand in the crossing. Guess we're getting married. She almost laughed. It came out instead as something caught halfway between a laugh and a breath, and she took his offered hand in hers, her fingers, calloused from sword and rein, easily twice the width of his, and shook it once, formal as a trade agreement, though something in her chest had already begun, quietly and without her permission, to crack. The well house behind the trading post was the only quiet place left once the crowd finally dispersed, muttering about orc tempers and about Garrick Voss getting exactly what a man like him deserved. And it was there, an hour later, that Noah found her again, sitting on the low stone lip of the well he himself had dug 3 summers before, staring down into the dark water she could not see the bottom of. He came alone, without the deputy, without the priest who would perform the binding at dusk, without anyone from the council who had arranged this whole affair between 2 peoples, who had spent a generation trying to kill each other along the very road that now brought her to him. He carried 2 cups of water, plain tin, nothing fine, and he offered her one without ceremony. Figured you might be thirsty, he said. It's good water, sweetest in the valley if you don't mind me saying so myself. Dura took the cup. Her hand was steady again, the warrior's mask fitted back into place, but something in her eyes was not quite steady at all. You should not have interfered today, she said. Garrick Voss is a coward, but cowards remember insults longer than brave men do. He will make trouble for you now. He was already going to make trouble for me, Noah said, sitting on the well's edge a respectful arm's length from her, looking not at her but out at the wide brown sweep of the plains and the wagon road cutting through it like a pale scar. Man's hated me since I was 17, doesn't need a new reason. He drank from his own cup. Besides, nobody should get to put hands on another person like that, orc or otherwise. Most men in this crossing would disagree with you. Most men in this crossing haven't had to dig a well by themselves in the middle of a drought while their neighbors wait around wondering if they'll die of thirst before the water comes in, Noah said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of weathered honesty. You learn things about people doing that work, who thanks you, who doesn't, who only remembers you exist when they need something from the ground. He glanced at her sidelong. I reckon that's not so different from what they want from you. Dura's jaw tightened. They want peace bought with my body and my name, and they call it an honor. I know. Noah looked down into his cup. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for this either. Council needed an unmarried man with no family to speak against it if things went wrong. I fit the description. a dry, humorless huff of breath. Turns out being alone has its uses. Something in the way he said it plain, unadorned, without asking for pity made Dura turn and truly look at him for the first time since the square. Not the well-digger the town relied on and barely noticed. Not the stranger she was to be bound to before the sun went down. Just a tired, decent man with tallow on his hands who had asked her name when no one else had bothered. "You are not what I expected," she admitted. "Neither are you," Noah said. "I confess I didn't have much to go on besides Orc Bride and a lot of shouting from the council about treaty lines." Dura's fingers tightened around the cup. The water in it trembled slightly. "I was not meant to be the one they sent." Noah went still, sensing the shift in her voice, the way a man learns to read the change in soil before a wall of earth gives way. He said nothing, only waited, the way he had learned to wait at a well mouth for water that took its time coming. "My sister," Dura said. "Kara, she was the one chosen. Elder of our line, better suited to speak for the clan, better tempered than I have ever been. She rode the border patrol 2 months ago to clear the road ahead of the treaty envoys, human raiders, renegades who did not want peace, ambushed her patrol in the Ashroad Pass. Her voice did not break, not yet, but it had gone very flat, very controlled, the way a person speaks when the alternative is screaming. She died protecting 6 of our own scouts and 2 human traders who had no business being caught between armies. My father sent me in her place because the treaty could not wait, and because I would not let anyone else wear her name into that binding. So you wore her armor instead," Noah said quietly. "It was all I had left of her that still smelled of her," Dura said, and the flatness in her voice cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, like ice giving under a boot. "I have not cried for her. Not once. Not when they burned her body on the high ground, not when my father handed me this cuirass and told me I would finish what she started, not on the whole ride here through country full of men who hate the sight of me." She stared down into the well as though the dark water might hold an answer. "I did not think I had tears left to give her. Noah did not reach for her." He understood even then, even having known her only a handful of hours, that a woman like Dura Rageborn would not welcome an unearned touch. That comfort offered too soon and too easily would feel like another kind of insult. Instead, he simply said, gently, "What was she like? Your sister?" And that was the question that broke her. It was such a small thing. Not sympathy, not pity, not another demand for what she owed the treaty or the crown or the crossing, but simple, honest curiosity about the sister she had lost, spoken by a stranger who had no reason to care and asked anyway. And Dura Rageborn, daughter of warlord Kazrek Rageborn, veteran of 3 border skirmishes, a woman who had not shed a single tear at her sister's pyre while the whole clan watched, felt her throat close and her eyes burn, and for the first time in more years than she could easily count, she wept. She wept sitting on the stone lip of a well in a dusty trading post at the edge of 2 nations' worth of old hatred, wept with her face in her scarred hands while her sister's armor creaked softly with the shudder of her shoulders, and Noah Hale, quiet, ordinary, overlooked Noah Hale, did the only thing that felt right to do. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply sat beside her, close enough that she would know she was not alone in it, and let her cry until the crying had run its course, the way water eventually finds its own level no matter how deep the well. "Her name was Kara," Dura said at last, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her voice raw but steadier. "She used to say that a warrior who never learned to laugh had already lost." "She sounds like she was worth crying for," Noah said. Dura looked at him for a long moment, amber eyes still wet, tusks catching the low afternoon light. "You are the first person on this whole cursed road who has asked me anything about myself instead of the treaty," she said. "The first who asked my name and meant the question." "Well," Noah said, with the faint, crooked ghost of a smile, "seemed important to know, considering we're about to be married." The binding that evening was a small, awkward affair conducted in the trading post's common yard by a traveling priest who clearly wished to be anywhere else. With the town council standing stiff, and suspicious on one side, and a handful of Dura's clan escort grim, silent orc riders who had brought her this far and would ride back at dawn, standing equally stiff on the other. There was no feast, no music, only a length of red cord looped once around their joined wrists as the priest muttered the treaty vows about peace between peoples and duty to the crown and the border, vows that had nothing to do with the two people actually standing there. But when the priest asked if they consented, Noah Hale said, "I do," and meant it in a way he had not expected to, looking at the woman beside him who had wept an hour before and now stood tall again, jaw set, sister's armor gleaming faintly in the torchlight. And when it was Dura's turn, she said, "I do," in the low tongue of the treaty, and then quietly only for him in her own tongue, a phrase her escort's eyes widened to hear. A phrase that meant, roughly, "I choose this asterisk," which was not required by any treaty and which she had not planned to say at all. Neither of them kissed the other that night. It was not that kind of wedding. They shook hands again instead, formal as the first time, though something had shifted in the grip, something neither of them named yet. The days that followed were not easy ones. Stonewall Crossing was a town built on wary tolerance rather than welcome, a trading post strung along the long, dusty wagon road between the human hold at Falmark and the Rageborn clan's High Plains territory, and its people had spent a generation burying sons and brothers along that same road. Some nodded to Dura in the street now, chastened by the tale of Garrick Voss on his knees. Most still crossed to the far side of the road when she walked it, and more than a few muttered that the council had bought their peace with an axe hanging over all their necks. Dura bore it the way she bore most things, chin high, sword at her hip, giving no one the satisfaction of seeing it land. But Noah noticed. In the small ways a man notices things when he has spent his life paying close attention to the ground beneath his feet. How she squared her shoulders a fraction tighter each time a shopkeeper's wife pulled her children away. How her hand found the pommel of her blade not in threat, but simply for the comfort of something solid to hold on to. He gave her, in those first days, the only thing he had to give, his work, and his company in doing it. "You don't have to follow me around a mud hole all day," he told her on the third morning, standing waist-deep in the half-dug well he'd been commissioned to finish for a farmstead 2 miles east of the crossing, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cool morning air. "I imagine there are finer ways to spend a wedding week." "There is nothing else for me to do," Dura said, sitting on an overturned bucket at the lip of the hole, watching him work with an expression that was not quite boredom and not quite interest but something curious hovering between the two. "The council does not trust me near the treasury or the granary stores. The women in town do not trust me near their children. The men do not trust me near their daughters or their sons, for that matter. This," she gestured at the mud and the shovel and the sweating man below her, "is at least honest work. I would rather watch honest work than sit alone in that house pretending to be a proper wife." "Suit yourself," Noah said, and heaved another shovelful of red clay up over the lip, narrowly missing her boots. "Though if you're going to sit there, you might as well make yourself useful. Is that a request or a challenge, well digger? Little of both, maybe." He nodded toward the second shovel leaning against the pile of raised earth. "Farmer wants this well finished by week's end. I could use another back on it if you're not too proud for mud." Dura looked at the shovel, then at him, then to his genuine surprise rose from the bucket, stripped off her vambraces and set them carefully aside, though she kept the cuirass on, he noticed, as if she could not quite bring herself to remove her sister's armor even for labor, and climbed down into the hole beside him. "I have dug graves," she said, testing the shovel's weight in her hands. "I imagine a well cannot be so different." It was, in fact, very different, and she said so loudly and often over the following hour, cursing in her own tongue when the clay stuck to the shovel's face, laughing, actually laughing, a rich, surprised sound that seemed to startle her as much as it startled him, when Noah showed her the trick of angling the blade to let the earth slide free. By midday they had made more progress than Noah usually made alone in a full day's work. And by evening, walking back toward the crossing with mud drying on both their forearms, something between them had shifted again, quiet and unspoken, the way ground settles after a long rain. "You are a good teacher," Dura said, as the crossing's lanterns came into view along the darkening road. "Patient. My father was never patient. He believed a warrior learned best through pain." "I've found people learn better when they're not afraid of the person teaching them," Noah said. "Also, I only had the one shovel to spare, so I couldn't very well hit you with it and expect to keep digging." Dura's laugh this time was quieter, warmer, and she bumped her shoulder against his carefully, mindful of her own strength. But it still nearly staggered him in a gesture that felt, for the first time, almost fond. That night, over a supper of bread and dried meat, and the sweet well-water Noah was so proud of, she asked him about his own family, and he told her, plainly, without self-pity, that his mother had died of fever when he was 12 and his father had left for the eastern mines not long after and never written, that he had learned well digging from an old drifter who passed through the crossing one summer and needed a strong back to pay him with, that he had been digging wells and minding his own business and being mostly invisible to the town he served ever since. "They do not see you," Dura said, watching him across the small table, the lantern light catching the tired lines around his eyes. "Even though every drop of water in this crossing passes through your hands, that is a strange kind of loneliness." "I got used to it," Noah said. "You should not have to get used to it," Dura said, and there was something fierce in the way she said it, fierce the way she had been fierce with Garrick Voss in the square, except now the fierceness was aimed outward on his behalf instead of her own. A man who gives a whole valley its water should not be a man nobody bothers to look at. Noah felt something in his chest turn over, slow and warm, unfamiliar. "You're looking at me," he said. "Yes," Dura said simply, amber eyes steady on his in the lantern light. "I am." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Dura reached across the small table slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and rested her large, calloused hand over his smaller one, and Noah did not pull away at all. The attack came 4 nights later, on the eve of what the council had planned as a formal binding feast. A larger, grander ceremony meant to be seen by traveling merchants and border officials alike, proof to the whole territory that the treaty held, that human and orc could stand at the same table without drawing blades. Lanterns had been strung along the trading post's central square, tables dragged out and laden with roasted meat and bread and the crossing's best cider. And for one evening at least, even the wary townsfolk had softened enough to raise cups toward the strange couple seated at the head table, the quiet well-digger and the tall orc woman in her sister's armor, who had over 4 days become something the whole crossing was beginning, cautiously, to talk about with less venom than before. It was Dura who heard them first, riders, many of them, coming fast along the wagon road from the east where no caravan was due, and coming without the courtesy of torches. She was on her feet before the alarm bell even rang, sword already in hand, years of border patrol instinct snapping into place faster than thought. "Riders," she said, voice cutting across the music and laughter like a blade through cloth. "A dozen, maybe more. Not merchants." The bell in the watchtower began to clang a heartbeat later, frantic and too late, and then the raiders were among them. Not orc raiders as half the panicking crowd first screamed, but human riders in dark leathers, faces wrapped against dust and recognition, torches already lit and swinging toward the granary and the stables. Ashroad riders, deserters and border bandits who had made their living for years off the chaos of the human-orc conflict, and who stood to lose everything if the treaty truly held. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man on a black horse with a scar cutting white through his beard, reined up at the square's edge and bellowed for the crowd to scatter or burn with the trading post. Noah grabbed the nearest child, a farmer's boy no older than 8 who had frozen mid-run. eyes wide with terror, and shoved him toward his mother, then turned to find Dura already moving, already a storm given shape. What happened next would be told and retold along the wagon road for years afterward, in taverns and trading posts from Falmark to the high plains, and every telling would swear it lost nothing in the retelling because nothing needed adding. Dura Rageborn did not wait for the raiders to reach the tables. She went to them. She moved through the chaos of the square like something out of the old war stories the Crossing's grandfathers still told around winter fires. Not wild, not reckless, but with the terrible, economical grace of a warrior who had spent her whole life training for exactly this moment, and had simply never before been given a reason worth using it. Her sister's armor, the armor Garrick Voss had mocked 4 days before, turned aside a raider's blade with a shriek of metal on hardened leather that should not have been possible and was anyway. And Dura's own sword answered with a stroke that unhorsed the man before he understood. He'd struck a killing blow that hadn't killed. A second rider came at her from the flank, torch raised to fling into the nearest hay cart, and Dura caught his wrist mid-throw with her bare hand, wrenched him bodily from the saddle, and threw him, a grown man in full leather, 10 feet through the air, into the well-house wall hard enough to crack the timber. The crowd, which had begun the evening as her wary hosts, now stood frozen in the lantern light, watching an orc woman single-handedly turn back a raid that would have burned half the crossing to the ground, and the sound that rose from them, once the shock cracked, was not fear. It was awe. Noah. Dura's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with warning rather than fear, and Noah spun to find the scarred raider leader bearing down on him directly, sword drawn, having marked the well-digger as the easiest target in reach. A small, unarmed man standing between the raiders and the fleeing townsfolk. Noah did not run. He had spent his whole life being the man no one noticed, the man who worked quietly at the edges of other people's lives, and something in him, some stubborn, long-buried refusal to be invisible in the one moment that mattered most, made him snatch up an iron-shod digging spade from the cart beside him and plant his feet instead. The raider's blade came down. Noah caught the blow on the spade's flat with a shock that jarred up both arms and nearly took the tool from his hands, but he held, boots skidding in the dust, and in the half-second the raider took to raise his sword again, Dura arrived like a falling wall. She did not simply strike the raider. She put herself bodily between him and Noah, shoulder into the man's chest hard enough to lift him off his feet, and as he crashed backward into the dirt she was already on him, sword point at his throat, amber eyes blazing in the torchlight. "Call them off," she snarled, "or I paint this square with what's left of you." The raider leader Bastion Crow, though no one in the crossing yet knew his name, spat blood and dust and glared up at her with pure, undisguised hatred. "You think one bride's temper scares us, orc? We've killed dozens of your kind on this very road." "Then you know exactly what I am capable of," Dura said, and pressed the blade a fraction closer. "Call them off." He did not call them off. Instead, his hand snapped toward a hidden knife at his belt, and Dura moved faster, disarming him with a brutal twist that broke 2 of his fingers and left him screaming in the dirt. And that scream, more than any command, was what finally broke the raider's nerve. 2 more had already fallen to the crossing's own hastily armed deputies, and a furious circle of farmers wielding pitchforks and hunting bows. The rest, seeing their leader broken and bleeding and the townsfolk rallying with an orc warrior at their head instead of cowering from her, wheeled their horses and fled back into the dark, leaving Bastion Crow alone in the dust of the square he'd meant to burn. The crowd's silence, when it finally came, was total. Every face in Stonewell Crossing turned toward Dura Rageborn's sword still drawn, sister's armor scored and scarred but unbroken, chest heaving with exertion, and toward Noah Hale standing behind her, spade still gripped white-knuckled in his hands, and something in the collective breath of the town changed forever in that single moment. It was Garrick Voss, of all people, who broke the silence, stepping forward from where he'd been cowering behind an overturned table, his broken pride from 4 days before apparently forgotten in the face of what he'd just witnessed. "She saved us," he said, hoarse, disbelieving. "She saved the whole crossing." "She saved my life," Noah said, lowering the spade at last, his voice not entirely steady. "Twice in about a minute." Dura turned to him then, sword still in hand, chest still heaving, and for a moment the fierce warrior mask slipped entirely, replaced by something raw and searching. "You should have run," she said. "You could have died standing there." "So could you," Noah said. "You didn't run either." "I am not afraid to die," Dura said. "Neither was I," Noah said quietly, "standing next to you." Something passed between them then that the watching crowd, still stunned, still catching their breath, could not have named, but every one of them felt a current, a claiming, a decision made without a single further word. Dura closed the distance between them in 2 strides, sheathed her sword in one smooth motion, and cupped Noah's face in both her large hands, tilting it up to hers with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from a woman who had just broken a man's fingers and thrown another through the air. "You stood in front of that blade for people who barely tolerate you," she said, low only for him, though half the square could still hear. "For a town that does not deserve either of us. I stood in front of it for you," Noah said. "The town's just lucky I was already standing there." Dura kissed him then, in the torchlit square with the wreckage of the raid still smoldering around them, and the entire population of Stonewell Crossing watching in open-mouthed silence, kissed him fiercely and without apology, the way she did everything, and Noah's hands came up to grip her forearms, the only part of her not encased in leather and steel, and kissed her back with everything 4 days of quiet, careful, growing devotion had built between them. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Dura pressed her forehead to his, amber eyes bright with something that was not quite tears this time but close to it. "In my clan," she said quietly, "when a warrior wishes to claim a mate, truly claim them, beyond any treaty, beyond any council's arrangement, there is a right, a mark given in the heat of victory, freely offered and freely accepted. It cannot be undone. It cannot be bought or bargained away by any council in any crossing." She searched his face. "I did not think I would ever want to give it, not after Cora, not to anyone. And now?" Noah asked, though he already knew the answer, could feel it in the way her hands had not left his face. "Now I want to give it to you," Dura said. "If you will have it. If you will have me, not the treaty's bride, not my sister's shadow in her armor, but me, Dura." "I asked for your name the first hour I met you," Noah said, voice rough. "I'm not about to stop wanting the rest of you now." She kissed him again, softer this time, and then, before the gathered crowd, before Garrick Voss and the deputies and the farmers still gripping their pitchforks, before the raider leader groaning in the dust with his ruined hand cradled to his chest, Dura Rageborn tilted Noah's head aside and set her mouth to the joint of his neck and shoulder, and bit down, not savagely, not to wound, but with a controlled, deliberate pressure that broke skin and left a mark shaped unmistakably like the curve of a tusk. A claiming bite that would scar pale and permanent against his sun-browned skin for the rest of his life. Noah hissed at the sharp, bright pain of it, then let out a breath that was almost a laugh, dazed and half-drunk on adrenaline and her nearness. "That going to happen every time you get excited?" "Only when I mean it," Dura murmured against his throat, and then softer only for him. "I mean it, Noah Hale." The crossing healer, an older woman named Myrna who had watched the whole exchange with her hand pressed to her mouth, finally found her voice enough to mutter, "Well, I suppose that settles the paperwork the council was so worried about." And the tension in the square broke all at once into stunned, relieved, disbelieving laughter, and someone, no one ever agreed afterward exactly who, began to clap, and then the whole battered, smoke-smelling square was clapping, cheering for the orc bride who had saved their homes and the well-digger who had stood beside her without flinching. They bound Bastion Crow's wrists with rope meant for hauling grain sacks and locked him in the trading post storage cellar to await the border patrol, and though he cursed and spat threats through the cellar door about how this was not finished, how the Ash Road riders would return, Most of the crossing was too busy staring at Dura Rageborn with new eyes to pay him much mind. They did not hold the formal binding feast that night. There seemed little point, with half the tables overturned and the granary still smoldering at one corner. And besides, something far more real had already happened in that square than any priest's ceremony could have blessed. Instead, the townsfolk who had spent 4 days crossing the road to avoid her now came, one by one, hesitant but sincere, to press Dura's hand or simply nod their thanks. And Dura accepted each gesture with a stiffness that was slowly, visibly softening as the night wore on. It was well past midnight before Noah and Dura finally found their way back to the small house at the edge of the crossing that the council had granted them for the marriage, a modest place, 2 rooms and a hearth, nothing grand, but theirs. Dura paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame, looking back at the square where lantern lights still flickered, and a few determined townsfolk were already working to right the overturned tables. "They looked at me tonight the way they look at each other," she said, wondering, as if she could hardly believe it. "Not the way they look at a weapon they are afraid might turn on them." "You earned that," Noah said, standing close behind her, close enough now that the mark on his neck ached pleasantly with the memory of her mouth against it. "Though for what it's worth, I already looked at you that way. From the first day." Dura turned to him in the doorway, the moonlight catching the fine dust of the battle still clinging to her armor, to the lines of her face, and something in her expression had gone soft in a way the whole crossing would have found unrecognizable an hour before. "I was sent here to be a treaty," she said. "A price paid for peace between people who hate each other. I expected to be tolerated at best. I did not expect," she stopped, searching for words that did not come easily to a warrior more accustomed to commanding than confessing. "I did not expect to be wanted." "You're not a treaty to me," Noah said. "You haven't been since I asked your name, and you actually gave it to me instead of just standing there being angry at the whole world." He reached up, carefully, and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her face, his fingers grazing the fresh mark she'd left on her own skin from where his fingers had gripped her forearms in the heat of the kiss. "You're the first thing in this valley that's ever made me feel like I wasn't just background to everyone else's story." Dura made a low sound in her throat, something between a growl and a sigh, and pulled him through the doorway and into the small house, kicking the door shut behind them with a heel. And what followed was not spoken of loudly in the crossing afterward, though everyone who passed near the little house that night and saw the lamp burning long past the hour, any respectable household should have been awake understood well enough without needing details. She undid the buckles of her sister's armor one by one slowly in the lamplight, and Noah helped her with the ones at her back that her own arms could not quite reach, his hands steady despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. And when the last of the hardened leather finally came away and was set with care on the room's single chair. Because even now, even in this, she would not simply drop her sister's memory carelessly to the floor. What remained was simply Dura. Warm skin and old scars, and a heartbeat as strong and steady as the earth Noah had spent his whole life digging into. He touched her the way he approached a well that had taken months to find water in, with patience, with reverence, with the quiet certainty that what he was uncovering was worth every bit of the labor it had taken to reach it. She, in turn, handled him with a tenderness that surprised them both, this woman built for war learning, touch by careful touch, the particular gentleness that loving an ordinary, decent man required. And if the night that followed was passionate, and it was, fierce and warm and unhurried once the first urgency had passed, it was also, underneath everything, an act of 2 lonely people finally, fully being seen. Morning came gray and soft through the shutters, and Dura woke first, as she always did, some old instinct from years of border watches refusing to let her sleep past dawn even in peacetime. She lay still for a long moment, Noah's arm heavy and warm across her waist, his breathing slow and even against her shoulder, and she found herself thinking with a clarity that startled her that she had not felt this settled, this home, in longer than she could remember. Not since before Kara died. Perhaps not ever. She reached over without waking him and touched the mark on his throat where her tusk had broken skin the night before, already scarring pale against his sun-browned collarbone, a permanent brand that no council, no treaty, no priest's cord could ever undo. Mine asterisk, she thought, and felt the word settle into her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a well at last. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Bastian Crow escaped the Border Patrol's custody a fortnight later, bribing or overpowering a careless guard on the road to Falmark. No one was ever entirely certain which. And word reached the crossing that he had gathered a smaller, angrier remnant of the Ashroad riders and sworn a blood oath to return and finish what the raid had started, this time with the Orc bride as his specific and personal target for the humiliation she dealt him. The council, rattled anew, debated whether the marriage and the treaty it represented was worth the continued risk, and it was here that Garrick Voss, of all unlikely allies, found his voice again, this time turned toward a different purpose. I said plenty of ugly things about her when she first rode in, he told the assembled council, standing in the very square where he'd once spat at Dura's feet, his broken pride from that day apparently mended into something more useful. But I watched her put her body between that madman's blade and half this town's children. I watched her save the well-digger who's kept every family in this crossing from dying of thirst for 10 years running, and never asked for a copper more than his due. If any of you want to send her back over some coward's grudge, you'll have to explain to me why we deserve peace bought with her blood but not her staying to enjoy it. The council, chastened, did not vote to annul the marriage, though the threat of Bastian Crow's return hung over the crossing like a held breath for the better part of a month. Dura spent those weeks training a handful of the crossing's younger men and women farmers' sons, a blacksmith's daughter with a fierce swing and no fear of anyone, even Garrick Voss's own nephew, in the basics of standing their ground, while Noah quietly reinforced the town's well houses and grain stores against fire, the two of them settling into a rhythm that felt, more each day, less like a bargain struck between strangers and more like a life chosen and built together. Crow returned on a night with no moon, as such men always seem to prefer, riding at the head of 8 remaining raiders with fire and vengeance both in mind, and found Stonewell crossing this time forewarned, gates barred, torches lit along the palisade. The townsfolk had spent the intervening weeks reinforcing at Noah's quiet suggestion and Dura's tireless supervision. The battle that followed at the crossing's gate was shorter and far less one-sided than Crow had hoped. Dura met him at the very threshold of the trading post's main gate, the wide timber archway that marked the boundary between the wagon road and the town proper, sword drawn, sister's armor gleaming in torchlight once more. And this time, it was not only Noah standing behind her but a dozen townsfolk with bows and spears, and the hard-won courage of people who had already survived one such night and refused to be victims of a second. "You should have stayed dead to me the first time you ran," Dura called across the gap, voice ringing clear over the crackle of torches and the nervous shuffle of horses. "I gave you mercy that night. I will not make the same mistake twice." "Mercy," Crow spat, nursing his still crooked fingers around his sword hilt. "You broke my hand and left me for the crows, orc bitch. I don't call that mercy." "I call it more than you deserved," Dura said. "Ride away now and I will let you keep the rest of your fingers." He did not ride away. He charged instead, and his remaining raiders with him, and the fight that followed at the gate of Stonewell Crossing was fierce but brief. The crossing's defenders trained, prepared, and no longer strangers to violence after the first raid's hard lesson, meeting the charge with a coordination that scattered the raiders within minutes. Noah, standing exactly where he'd stood before with the same iron-shod spade in his hands, caught the flank of a raider trying to circle behind Dura and drove the tool's edge hard into the man's mount's reins, spooking the horse and sending its rider tumbling into the dirt where 2 of the crossing's farmers wrestled him down. Dura herself went straight for Bastian Crow, And this time there was no interruption, no crowd to save him from the reckoning she'd promised weeks before. Their blades met twice, 3 times, sparks flying in the torchlight, and on the fourth exchange Dura's sword found the gap in his guard his broken fingers could no longer properly protect, and Bastion Crow fell at last at the threshold of the very town he'd meant to burn twice, his raiders either dead, fled, or surrendering their weapons into the dust the moment they saw their leader go down. Silence fell over the gate, broken only by the crackle of torches and the ragged breathing of the crossing's defenders, and Dura stood over the fallen raider leader, chest heaving, sister's armor once again scored but unbroken, and looked up to find Noah already crossing the churned earth toward her, unharmed, spade still in hand. "You're not hurt," she said, and it was not quite a question, more a plea for confirmation. "Not a scratch," Noah said, "though I think I owe this spade a proper thanks. It's held off 2 sword blows now, might deserve a name of its own at this point." Dura laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Adrenaline and relief tangled together, and sheathed her sword, and looked around at the crossing's gate, at the torches still burning, at Garrick Voss standing with a borrowed spear and a split lip, and an expression of grim satisfaction, at the blacksmith's daughter helping bind a wounded farmer's arm, at the whole battered, brave little town that had, in the space of a few weeks, gone from fearing her to fighting beside her. "This is my home now," she said, quiet, almost wondering, as if the realization had only just fully settled into her bones. "Not my father's war camp, not the treaty line, here. With you, with them." "Feels that way to me too," Noah said. They stood together at the threshold of the gate, the literal boundary between the wagon road that had once seemed only a place of danger and loss, and the town that had become, against every expectation either of them had carried into that first dusty confrontation weeks before, a home worth defending with everything they had. The crossing's people gathered slowly around them in the torchlight, exhausted and battle-worn but alive, and it was Myrna the healer who finally broke the hush, stepping forward with the particular brisk authority of a woman who had delivered more babies and set more broken bones than she could count, and had run out of patience for solemnity. "Well," she said, planting her hands on her hips, looking between the two of them, "seeing as the council's binding cord got trampled into the mud during the first raid and nobody's bothered replacing it since, and seeing as you two have apparently decided to seal your own vows with sword and spade instead of waiting on priests, I don't suppose either of you would object to making it official, properly, in front of people who actually want to see it this time." Dura looked at Noah. Noah looked at Dura. Somewhere behind them, someone had already started dragging the trading post's long table back out into the square, and someone else was calling for what remained of the cider that hadn't been lost to the first fire. "I already gave my word once," Dura said slowly, "under a treaty I did not choose, to a man I did not know, in an armor that belonged to a sister I had not yet finished mourning." She reached for Noah's hand, threading her fingers through his, calloused palm against calloused palm, and something in her voice when she continued was steady in a way that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with choice. "I would like to say it again, properly. Meaning every word this time, in front of the people who watched us earn it. I never stopped meaning it," Noah said, "but I'm not opposed to saying it again where more people can hear." So it was that at the threshold of Stonewell Crossing's gate, with torches still burning against the retreating dark, and the bodies of the fallen already being carried off with quiet respect, and the survivors of 2 raids gathered close around them, Noah Hale and Dura Rageborn stood hand in hand and spoke their vows a second time. Not the treaty's borrowed words this time, but their own. "I, Dura Rageborn, daughter of Kazrek, sister of Kara, choose you, Noah Hale, not because any council commanded it, not because any treaty demanded it, but because you asked my name when no one else thought to, and because you stood beside me with nothing but a shovel between yourself and death rather than run. I will stand at your side for as long as you'll have me. I will carry my sister's armor and your mark upon my heart both, and neither will ever crowd out the other." "I Noah Hale," Noah said, and his voice, though quieter than hers, carried just as clear in the hushed square. "Choose you, Dura Rageborn, because you looked at a man nobody in this crossing ever really saw and decided he was worth choosing anyway. Because you cried in front of me on the worst day of your life and trusted me enough to let me sit beside you while you did it. Because I have dug wells in this valley for 10 years feeling like background to everyone else's story, and you made me feel, for the first time, like the center of my own. I will stand at your side for as long as you'll have me, too. I don't think that's ever going to run out." Myrna, without any particular authority to do so beyond the town's collective, exhausted, joyful agreement that authority mattered less than truth tonight, pronounced them properly wed, and the cheer that rose up from the gathered crossing was loud enough to carry clear across the dark plains toward the wagon road and the distant hills beyond, where, had anyone been riding that lonely stretch that night, they might have wondered what kind of celebration could possibly be happening at a border trading post so recently scarred by raiders' fire. Dura kissed Noah then, at the threshold of the gate, with the same fierce, unguarded devotion she'd shown the whole crossing in battle twice over, and Noah kissed her back with all the quiet, steady certainty of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of being overlooked, found the one person in the world who would never once look past him again. They walked back to their small house together as the sky began, faintly, to lighten toward dawn, Dura's sister's armor slung over one arm now, finally set aside for the night, her free hand laced tight through Noah's, and at their own threshold, the humble doorway of the little two-room house the council had granted them weeks before as an afterthought to a treaty neither of them had asked for. Dura paused. "I want you to know," she said, "that I will keep wearing Kara's armor. Not because I am still hiding behind her memory, but because she deserves to see, in whatever way the dead see anything, that the treaty she died defending held, that it was worth something in the end." Her eyes were bright again, though this time the tears that gathered there did not fall, held instead at the edge of something that looked almost like peace. "I think she would have liked you, Noah Hale. I think she would have laughed, seeing her little sister weep in a stranger's arms over a well and then marry him twice within the same season. I'd like to think she'd approve," Noah said gently. "Seems like she'd have wanted you to be happy, whatever that ended up looking like." "I did not think happy was something left for me," Dura admitted. "Not after the pyre, not carrying her armor and her name and her unfinished duty all at once." She looked at him, and the last of the night's exhaustion and grief and triumph all seemed to settle finally into something quiet and whole. "You gave that back to me, just by asking a question nobody else bothered to ask." "Just your name," Noah said. "It was never just my name," Dura said, and drew him close, resting her forehead against his the way she had the very first night he'd earned it, in the smoke and torchlight of a different battle. "It was everything after." They crossed the threshold together as the first true light of morning broke over the high plains, the wagon road stretching pale and quiet toward a horizon that no longer looked, to either of them, like the edge of danger, but like the beginning of every ordinary, extraordinary day still left for them to share. The well-digger and the war-bride who had come to Stonewell Crossing wearing her dead sister's armor and a stranger's ring finger, and stayed to become, against every hard history between their two peoples, exactly what neither of them had dared to hope for, chosen and wanted, and never, ever alone again. In the seasons that followed, the story of that night traveled the wagon road the way such stories always do, growing a little in the telling, the orc bride who threw a man 10 feet through the air, the well-digger who stood off a raider's blade with nothing but a shovel, the vows spoken twice, once for treaty and once for truth. Merchants passing through Stonewell Crossing took to asking, half in jest and half in genuine curiosity, to see the famous armor and the scar it had helped earn, and Dura would show them both without shame, the dark, sister-worn leather she still wore every day, and the pale, tusk-shaped mark on Noah's throat that he never once tried to hide. The council, chastened twice over by their own misjudgment, eventually granted them the deed to the small house outright, along with a modest plot of land beside it where Dura, in a gesture that surprised the whole crossing nearly as much as her arrival had, began cultivating a garden. Not out of any sudden domestic instinct, she was quick to insist, but because a warrior needed something to tend that did not require killing, and because Noah had once mentioned, quietly, that he'd always liked the idea of a home with something green growing beside it. Garrick Voss, in his own gruff way, became an unlikely regular visitor, bringing cuttings from his own ranch and staying to argue cheerfully with Dura about the best way to keep the deer from the vegetables. The old animosity between them long since burned away in the fire of that first terrible night and rebuilt into something like friendship. And on quiet evenings, when the wells were dug and the garden tended, and the wide plain sky turned gold and violet over the wagon road, Dura Rageborn and Noah Hale would sit together on the low stone bench Noah had built outside their door, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand resting over the mark she'd once left in a moment of victory in claiming both. And there was no treaty left to fulfill between them, no bargain left to honor, only the plain, unhurried truth of two people who had found in each other everything neither had known they were missing: a home, a name spoken and truly heard, and a love that no counsel, no war, no old hatred between their two peoples had ever managed to touch.